It's a pleasure to be here and to see all these names and all this interest in Canada. Canada is a beautiful country, and we have about 500 different work permit categories. We also have about 100 different permanent residence categories. Each one of them is subject to its own criteria. Some of them are very specific. Some of them are a little more general. Some of them are occupation specific. Some of them are specific in terms of age groups and specific in terms of education, specific in terms of language ability, particularly knowledge of French is a big issue for Anglophone speakers. It's very helpful if you know French as well as English. It really puts you in a stronger position in terms of immigration to Canada, as well as work permits to Canada. So lots of options to choose from whenever someone wants to come into Canada temporarily or permanently. There's also the opportunity to qualify for citizenship if you've had a parent born in Canada, or a parent who may not have been born in Canada, but who was a citizen of Canada, who spent some time in Canada prior to your birth. So those are the citizenship by descent options that I wanted to talk to you about. There's also the opportunity for you to come to Canada just to check it out without committing to starting employment in Canada or immigrating to Canada. And these are non-immigrant options. That would be, for example, if you come in for remote work, say you're working for maybe Ernst & Young in the US, and you decide that you want to work remotely somewhere for 6 months. You can come to Canada, check it out, decide whether you like Canada, whether Canada is for you or not. And if it is, great, we can move on to other non-immigrant options, work permit-based options, or we can move on directly to permanent residence if you qualify. So there are a lot of different options available to people, but you definitely, as American nationals, can come to Canada for up to 6 months per year. But beyond those 6 months, you can't stay in Canada for longer than 182 days per year, because first of all, from an immigration point of view, you're not allowed unless you have a specific reason for remaining. And then secondly, if you're in Canada, you have to pay taxes as a resident Canadian after you're in Canada for more than 6 months. So just bear that in mind. But visiting Canada for up to 6 months a year, buying a cottage up here, that's fine. As long as you have another home, another place of employment, and ties to some other country. In your case, it would be the US. And there's a little flexibility around that, but it's very important not to move up here and sort of expect to visit for 6 months and then stay, because you won't be allowed into Canada. You need to organize things strategically. So some of the common immigration categories for Americans are and the one I like the best for Americans, because it's very facilitative, and Becky can tell you this from her experience as well, is the CUSMA, the CUSMA professionals, scientists. It allows at least 50 different types of professionals, individuals who have at least a baccalaureate degree, including hotel managers, interior designers, scientists of all types, doctors, lawyers, accountants, technicians and technologists, graphic designers, huge engineers. Engineers are a huge part of this program. And many other scientists and professionals to enter Canada and work for a Canadian company without going through a very complex immigration process to come and work here temporarily. So basically, the employer has to sponsor you, but they don't have to do all the work that normally would involve a typical sponsorship by an employer. that would require a labor market impact assessment-based application. And what labor market impact assessment-based applications require is advertising and demonstrating that no Canadians have applied for the position, and therefore that you're entitled to take on this position because there aren't qualified Canadians interested in taking this job. So what we try to do is we try to bring in our American friends into Canada based on labor market impact assessment exemptions, because they're a tremendous amount of work for the Canadian employer, and it's a disincentive for Canadian employers to sponsor an American national if they have to do a labor market impact assessment. So, and Becky just shared the link to the list of occupations, so you can have a look at that. The other very popular route is intercompany transfers for Americans, where, for example, they're transferred from Ernst & Young in the US to Ernst & Young in Canada. And that gives them an edge because it allows them to obtain additional credits in order to immigrate to Canada. So we have a comprehensive ranking system, and the more credits you have, the more points you have, the easier it is to qualify. And just bear in mind that most American nationals are competing with H-1B refusals from the US, who are under 30, who are have master's degrees, who speak English fluently, and who have over 4 years of work experience. And so a lot of our ideal immigrant candidates from an immigration standpoint are these young H-1B professionals from that have not been able to get their H-1Bs in the US renewed. And so they apply for immigration to Canada and they generally qualify. So just bear that in mind, that age is a real issue when it comes to immigrating. And so a lot of people can't immigrate directly to Canada if they're over 30. They need a job offer. So starting your immigration process by first getting a job in Canada and qualifying under the CUSMA is a really wonderful way to get your foot in the door, to try out, see how you like being in Canada, and working here, and then applying for permanent residence once you have a work permit in Canada. So intercompany transfers is a great option if you work for a big company with a Canadian subsidiary and your company's willing to transfer you to Canada. And I strongly recommend that option, particularly if you're over 30. If you're under 30, I think it's worth looking at whether you actually qualify directly for immigration and not bother with a non-immigrant work permit. Instead of doing a non-immigrant work permit, check first if you're eligible for immigration. Other work permit categories would be treaty trader and investor visas under the CUSMA, as well as LMIA, as well as we have all these small little exemptions. For example, if you're coming in to Canada as a member of the clergy, you get a special work permit. If you're coming in to work at a charitable organization, there's a special work permit for that. And they're a little more facilitative than the labor market impact assessment process. Although there are facilitative labor market impact assessment process work permits, for example, for engineers and for people in IT, it's much easier. And it's a lot more palatable for an employer in Canada to sponsor you under an LMIA if you are an engineer or someone in IT. So there are a tremendous amount of non-immigrant categories. Another one is if you speak French fluently and are not wanting to immigrate to Quebec, there is a special exemption. There's other criteria involved in the process, but there is a special exemption for folks who want to use their French outside of Quebec. Let's talk for a few minutes about immigration status. So in terms of immigrant categories, and before I get into immigrant categories, I just wanted to explain a few things about immigration status, because US nationals aren't used to immigrating. They don't know the language necessarily. And so I just want to share with you what it means to have immigration status or apply for immigration. Immigration means naturalization. It means landing in Canada as a permanent resident and getting a 5-year permanent resident card. And it's also a path to Canadian citizenship so that you can vote in Canada and affect our elections and hopefully affect them more positively, which I'm sure is one of the reasons why you're on this webinar in the first place. Permanent residence and immigration status in Canada gives you the right to work. You also have the right to leave and re-enter Canada under conditions, but it's a fairly fluid right as a permanent resident. So I just wanted to explain that because that's distinct from a work permit where you don't have a pathway to citizenship. A work permit is based on a position, a job, and it's based on an employer sponsoring you in Canada. So basically, unless you're working for that employer, you have to leave Canada. So it's very important, once you do have a job in Canada, if you actually want to live here for the rest of your life, to regularize your status and become an immigrant, become a permanent resident. And then eventually, if you're interested, you can become a Canadian citizen, and we'll talk about that also. So in terms of immigration categories, the top immigration category is, of course, if you're married to a Canadian citizen, or if you have a parent who's a Canadian citizen. So you can sponsor your spouse, you can sponsor your child to Canada if they're under the age of 22. In terms of sponsoring your spouse, there's certain requirements. For example, you need to prove that you and your spouse are actually moving to Canada, that you're not just sponsoring your spouse so your spouse has permanent residence, but there's no intention to move to Canada. So I think that's an important issue that we need to raise, because a lot of people right now just want to sponsor their spouse without an intention of moving to Canada. And unfortunately, under the immigration regulations, that's not allowed. You have to plan to move to Canada or be in Canada. And there's 3 different distinct ways of sponsoring a spouse to Canada. And I'm not going to get into those because it'll take me for the rest of our session to talk about those. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go on and talk about other immigrant categories, because we've got, like I said, 100 different categories. So there's plenty of options, but each one is so specific, and they're all category based with selection criteria. And most of them not only have selection criteria, but they have point systems. And in the case of express entry, there's double point systems. So there's the comprehensive ranking system, and then you need to meet the federal skilled worker criteria. So in order to qualify for express entry, and express entry is a bit of a misnomer because it can take a long time to get your permanent residence, but express entry is a ranking system based immigration system, so that Canada as a country can select the most skilled candidates. And it's done based on this comprehensive ranking system. Once you meet the minimum criteria for either federal skilled work or based on occupational specific draws, if the government is specifically drawing engineers, for example, or IT people or people in the medical profession. You also have to meet the Canada Experience class category, if that's the particular category that makes sense for you to qualify under. You also have to meet the Provincial Nominee program category if that's what you're trying to qualify under. And there's so many different provincial nominee categories. But in any event, there's the express entry point system at the end of the day has it's not a lottery, but it is a draw, and there is a cutoff point. So if you're not within at the cutoff point or above, you won't get drawn. And so as immigration lawyers, one of our jobs is to make sure that our applicants have a pretty strong score, because if they don't, we're wasting our time, and we're wasting their time and their money by helping them immigrate to Canada in a way that's not going to work. So it's so important to know what to expect from the government in terms of these draws, and whether there's any likelihood of immigrating and what the likelihood is. And we can generally assign a certain percentage. You've got probably around 95% likelihood of success on your immigration based on your federal skilled worker score and your comprehensive ranking score, or you have 50% likelihood of success, or basically you've got zero likelihood of success. So it's important for you to be able to make a business decision as to whether it's worth you even considering immigrating to Canada. And I think that's something that people really appreciate when they're getting advice on whether they qualify based on their specific criteria. There's the Canada Experience class, as I talked about earlier, which is part of the express entry application system. But the Canada Experience class, one of the requirements is that you work in Canada for a minimum of 1 year. That's one of the qualifications for that class, along with being competitive in the comprehensive ranking system score. And so most people who immigrate after 30 have to meet the Canada Experience class criteria at a minimum in order to qualify for immigration. And if they don't qualify under the Canada Experience class criteria, they may qualify based on an occupational specific draw, or based on employment-based permanent residence, which would involve a labor market impact assessment-based work permit and then an immigration application. But there is also a way that you can immigrate directly based on a labor market impact assessment. And one of the most important and most beautiful immigration options in Canada are the provincial nominee programs. And some of them are based on where you study and what you study. Some of them are based on where you work or what your occupation is. And some of them are based on entrepreneurial draws. So the entrepreneurial draw is a really wonderful option for immigrants who are a little older and may not have an interest in working for an employer, but want to start a business in Canada and have some business experience. And there's entrepreneurial options throughout Canada. So, and what we would like to do with individuals who are interested in this particular category, or with older Americans who don't want to be employed by a third party, is we would try to select the best province based on their background and their desired business plan, as well as their net worth. There is a really fabulous investor occupational immigration category, but it's only available to people who have a fairly good knowledge of French, and they would have to have a net worth of 2 million Canadian, and they'd have to invest the equivalent of 1.2 million in a government approved investment for 5 years, and then they get the million back, but not the 200,000. But there's a way that you can invest that money without actually providing the government with a million. There's government required organizations that have been selected by the Quebec government in order to do the financing through a bank. So if interest rates are low, the financing for for 5 years for $1 million is not very high. So it ends up being a fairly low investment in terms of the requirements for qualification for immigration. But unfortunately, that's our only passive investment opportunity. We do not have a retiree category for individuals who want to immigrate to Canada. So if you don't speak French, you're unfortunately out of luck. If you have children who are Canadians, then you could potentially qualify for their sponsorship under a parent visa lottery. And that's another immigration option. A lot of Americans, particularly if you're a minority or you're LGBTQ, think that applying for refugee status in Canada is a really great option, but it's not, because it means that you can't ever return to the United States. It means you'll always be separated from your family. You're stuck in Canada until you become a refugee and a permanent resident, and that can take several years. And then after that, you need to obviously become a citizen of Canada to get a proper passport so you can travel anywhere in the world. But you can't return to the US unless the political situation has fundamentally changed. And again, you have to be a citizenship, a citizen of Canada. So it's not as good an option as people think it is. It would be a great option if there is fear of persecution, but you've got to demonstrate that the fear of persecution isn't localized, but it's generalized throughout the US. So if the Supreme Court of Canada, the Supreme Court in the US generalizes legislation that would be tantamount to persecution, then definitely refugee category is something to seriously consider. So if there's discrimination, a basis for discrimination based on your race, your religion, your nationality, your membership to a particular social group or political opinion, and it's generalized, so there's nowhere in the US that you could possibly escape the law or feel safe, then it's a good option. So we're running out of time, but I did want to go back to Canadian citizenship, and I wanted to talk about 3 things. The first thing I wanted to talk about is, once you're a permanent resident of Canada, you have to live in Canada for 3 of 5 years. You need to be physically present for 3 years within a 5-year period to become a citizen of Canada.
Jacqueline, does that mean does that mean 365 days times 3, or what does?
Yes, that's exactly what it means.
Okay.
Yeah, that's 1,095 days. You have to be in Canada within a 5-year period. Yeah, and then you can vote, you can stand for elections. Once you're a citizen, you don't have to maintain permanent residence anymore. Maintenance of permanent residence means that you have to be in Canada 2 out of 5 years. And every 5 years, you have to renew your permanent resident card until you become a citizen. Of course, if you're married to a Canadian national, you don't have to worry about losing your permanent residence. You still have to apply for your new card every 5 years, but you qualify for a new card based on the fact that you're accompanying a Canadian national abroad. So as long as your spouse is with you and you're outside of Canada, every single day counts as a day in Canada, which is a beautiful thing. And then, of course, there's the citizenship by descent categories, and the citizenship by descent is a complex monster because we've got so many incarnations of our Citizenship Act. But generally, the rule is, if you're first generation born abroad, you have an entitlement to Canadian citizenship. So if your mom was born in Canada, even if you were born in the US, you will likely qualify for Canadian nationality. You will likely be eligible for Canadian citizenship. And And in fact, it's an automatic right, but you actually have to apply for it. And the application process can be complex, but nonetheless, it's a wonderful opportunity, and it certainly skips a lot of steps, right? If you can just become a Canadian citizen. The other thing I wanted to mention is that if you do become a Canadian citizen, it doesn't mean you lose other citizenships. So if you're already a US and an Italian national, Canada allows for you to become a Canadian citizen. So you'll have to check with Italy to see what their rules are, but Becky can tell you what the US rules are.
Well, and thanks, Jacqueline. That actually is a great lead in, because I think it's time for Q&A, and we have a whole bunch of questions that we've gathered. And the first one was about dual citizenship. And I had actually answered in the chat that the US does allow dual citizenship, and that you would later tell us about Canadian citizenship. So I guess that we have the answer to that question.
Yes.
Great news. If you're a US citizen, you can also have Canadian citizenship. So the second question in the chat was about retired people, and you did say that there is no retirement visa in Canada. So I think that some of the options that you've addressed might apply to retired people.
Yeah.
But no options specifically based on retirement. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's no retirement permanent residence category. You can't just come and spend the rest of your life in Canada as a retiree. What you can do is you can retain your US residence and retain your US infrastructure, but have a cottage in Canada. So say in the summers or for up to 6 months every year, you could come up to Canada and enjoy Canada. But unfortunately, you won't qualify for our universal health care as a visitor. So just bear that in mind.
That's an important point.
Yeah.
So there are a few family-based questions. Actually, I want to start with this employment-based question about the CUSMA, because I also wanted to note, I think it's kind of funny. We call it the USMCA. You call it the CUSMA, and probably the Mexicans call it the, MACUSA or something like that. It used to be the NAFTA, for anyone who's wondering. So now it's the USMCA or the CUSMA. And the question is, if someone enters under that treaty and the annulment is modified or annulled, how would that impact their status in Canada? So I think from the US perspective, if the treaty is annulled and they do away with the work provisions, which is something that was discussed during the prior Trump administration, then your status in the US would end. How about in Canada? How would you?
Yeah, in Canada, your status wouldn't automatically end immediately once the CUSMA is null and void. You would be able to remain in Canada under your CUSMA work permit for the validity of the work permit. You may not be able to continue working under the CUSMA unless we enact domestic legislation indicating that you may, which is quite likely that we would, because we're a humanitarian-based country. And so if people are already here on work permits and an employer has sponsored them, based on our current government framework, I can't imagine them not enacting some policy or legislation indicating that you can remain and continue working for the length of your current work permit. But regardless of whether that happens or not, you can actually remain in Canada for the length of your work permit, because that is codified in our regulations. So if you lose your employment or the category no longer exists, you can remain in Canada as a visitor for 1, 2, 3 years, whatever the length of your work permit is.
Yeah. Okay, that's really nice, and that's much more humanitarian and generous than the US provision, which says if your work ends in the US, you need to leave immediately. There are a few categories that give you a 60-day grace period, but at most you get 60 days from the US side. We have here's a general question, which I think is relevant to many people since French language is important in Canadian immigration. How is fluency determined?
So there are actual tests. There's English tests and there's French tests, and everybody has to do them. I've actually had a PhD from one of the Ivy League universities in the UK balk at having to do a test, and then he actually didn't even get a perfect score. So
Oh, wow. Um, maybe he just didn't test well.
possibly, yeah.
So a few family-based questions. One person asked whether sponsorship for parents also applies to in-laws.
Uh, yeah, it does, but it would be you and your Canadian spouse, you and your permanent resident spouse, both sponsoring your in-laws. Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And then someone else, you mentioned that if your mom was born in Canada, that it's likely you're a Canadian citizen. Somebody wants to know about second generation, if their grandmother was born in Ontario in this case.
Yeah. Yeah, so that is actually it's in the past I would have said no. Very doubtful. I mean, they might fit into some little exemption here and there, but there was recently, and when I say recently, it's now almost a year old. December 2023, there was a Ontario Court of Appeal decision that came out that was incredibly uh, well, it shone a very bright light on citizenship law. And based on that, if there is ties to Canada prior to your birth from both your grandmother or your grandparent, who's the Canadian, as well as your mom, regardless of whether your mom became a Canadian citizen, then you may have a claim to Canadian citizenship. But your mom would have had to have some ties to Canada, maybe spent some time in Canada, had some connections to Canada, that were not just emotional, but either physical and property, and definitely would have had to spend some time in Canada. And this all would be assessed based on the time that she spent, the ties she had in Canada prior to your birth, not after your birth.
Okay, that makes sense. And there are some parallels to US law there as well. So remaining on the theme of family-based immigration, can a Canadian sponsor a family member other than a parent, for example, an aunt?
No,
No,
unfortunately, no, no.
so only parents.
Well, and even with parents, it's a lottery, so there's no right to sponsor. There used to be, but not anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, but you can sponsor your child if they're under the age of 23. Yeah,
Child under the age of 23. Very good.
22 and less. Yeah.
Okay. Here's a question about whether if there's a company specifically in Quebec that wants to hire somebody without a degree, is that still an option? And I want to pause to say under the USMCA, there are a few categories, such as management consultant, where you could come without a degree. Is that a parallel in Canadian law?
It
Can you
is,
under that?
absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, you don't have to have a degree. And there's a lot of positions that would allow you to obtain a work permit even if you don't have a degree. But it really depends on the occupation and what your background is.
Understood.
Yeah.
A question about health insurance. So you had mentioned earlier you can come for up to 6 months a year as a visitor, but of course you wouldn't get the benefits of health insurance. Someone's asking if retired people can get citizenship in Canada and get health insurance. And so maybe we could unpack that question, because I think the first question I have is, if you become a Canadian citizen, are you entitled to health insurance?
Not necessarily. Even if I spend a year abroad, I'm no longer entitled to Canadian health insurance. I have to wait for 3 months before I requalify for it. So there is a waiting time to requalify. And so, but if you're in Canada and you're a Canadian national, you're a Canadian citizen, whether it's by descent or some other category, yes, you definitely would qualify for health insurance in any of the provinces, but there may be a 2, 3, 4 month waiting time depending on the province. Healthcare is provincial, even though there's a federal component to it, and it is considered universal. It is a provincial jurisdiction. Yeah. Understood.
So the first part of that question, can retired people get citizenship in Canada? I think we already addressed there's no retiree specific provision for citizenship, but any of the
for immigration. Yeah, for immigration, there's no retirement specific. But if they qualify for citizenship by descent, then absolutely, yes. Yeah.
So that would be the way to do it. If you wanted to retire in Canada and get health insurance, you would need to qualify for citizenship by descent and then live in Canada to get the health insurance. Is that right?
Exactly. That's absolutely right.
Got it. Okay. One person asked if there are methods to connect potential investors with Canadian businesses. So I guess this person is a US citizen or someone in the US who maybe is interested in investing in a Canadian business and wants to know if you're a law firm or if there are services that would help connect potential investors with Canadian businesses to help the potential investor presumably get a visa.
Yeah, so there's no investor immigration per se. You would have to qualify for an entrepreneurial visa, which you couldn't just passively invest in Canada unless you do the Quebec investment, which is very specific. So that wouldn't allow you to invest in private businesses. If you want to invest and it has nothing to do with immigration, I would recommend that there are a number of angel investment groups in Canada, and I would recommend that you contact them, or we can certainly send you a list of various contacts. The other thing you can do is you can contact the Trade Commission in Canada. But if you want to immigrate, if this whole question is based on you wanting to immigrate, then I'd recommend that you arrange a consultation through Becky, and we will advise you on the immigration component.
Perfect. All right, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So here's one about express entry. This person asks, for express entry, does work experience have to be in Canada, or does foreign work experience count? This is a multi-part question, so I'm just going to tell you all the parts. Are there specific industries that are more competitive and get more points? And how do you prove foreign experience?
Yeah, so sometimes you will need Canadian work experience because you just simply won't qualify for any of the categories based on foreign work experience for immigration. But if you're under 30 and you have a master's and you have 4 years of experience, you might just qualify directly, in which case your foreign work experience would be important because you do need that work experience proven. And just like any immigration program throughout the world, the visa office may contact your employer. So everything should be set out in writing, but the contact information for your employer, the duties of the job, what you were paid. Yeah, there's a lot of proof that you have to include. And it's the obvious proof, your HR records, your pay slips, maybe even a payroll statement per annum of employment, contracts of employment, a very strong letter of reference that meets the eligibility criteria for that category. Yeah, there's a lot that you would have to provide to demonstrate your work experience.
And that's why you need a great lawyer.
Yeah, well, you would know, Becky.
As we do, Jacqueline. So last question, I think this is an easy one. Can someone moving to Canada for a job bring a child who is over the age of 18 but under the age of 23?
Yeah, you could definitely bring a child within that age group. It's a little, and you would be able to do it both as an immigrant as well as a non-immigrant. As an immigrant, They would be landed, so it would make it very nice. You know, if they're over the age of 18 and they're starting college, they would be paying the visa tuition. They wouldn't be paying foreign visa student fees. They would be paying the tuition that Canadians pay, which is about 1/4 to 1/5 of the cost, and of whatever cost that people pay in the US. So it actually makes a lot of sense to immigrate and put your kids in university in Canada. I certainly would
Definitely.
consider that, yeah. But if you're coming as a work permit holder, then your child would not necessarily qualify for a work permit. So you would have to put them in school, and depending on the type of work permit you have and the duration, your child may qualify for a regular non-foreign visa student tuition allotment, as opposed to having to pay as a foreign student. But most often they would have to pay as a foreign student to go to school if they don't qualify for their own work permit. But you would probably want them in school anyway.
Exactly. All right. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have time for today. If we did not get to your question, Christina from GYH is going to email out a copy of this recording as well as our contact details. So feel free to reach out to me. We'll try to get an answer to any of your questions. We are available to consult if people have if you have a quick question that you asked today that we didn't get to, email it to me. If you want to have a more detailed discussion about immigrating to Canada or working in Canada, we'd be happy to help you have a consultation about that issue. And also our law firm does consultations about immigration around the world. So if you're interested in learning about immigrating to another country, we can help you with that as well. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you so much to Jacqueline for sharing your extensive knowledge of Canadian law. And hopefully I'll get to come visit you in Canada soon.
I sure hope so, Becky. That would be great.